Welcome back. We're talking about the viability of a two-state solution and prospects for peace in the Middle East. Joining us is Perry Cammack. He is with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Hussein Ibish is with the Arab Gulf States Institute. And Amotz Asa-El is a senior commentator with the Jerusalem Post. Thanks again for all of you being with us. Perry, let's move ahead. Looking at the peace process, we've talked about the situation that exists right now. But the peace process, I mean, all these discussions, all these talks have always been based on the fact that one day there were two states side by side. Is that still viable?
Well, I think there's a practical viability and a kind of metaphysical viability. I mean, in any conflict, there's always some potential for an agreement, but I think as a practical matter, in the current era we are in now, I think it's hard for me to see a pathway to a two-state solution. Now, that doesn't mean that the politics on both sides can't be kind of reset, upturned, that we might not have a new set of leaders kind of committed to this as an ideal. But for the time being, meaning for the horizon of the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's very difficult for me to imagine a kind of political process, either driven from the outside or that starts from the inside, that leads to a peaceful settlement of the conflict.
Amotz, as Perry says, it's hard for him to see a two-state solution. But let's take a listen to what the U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, had to say about a two-state solution. Let's watch.
The two-state solution is now in serious jeopardy. The truth is that trends on the ground, violence, terrorism, incitement, settlement expansion, and the seemingly endless occupation, they are combining to destroy hopes for peace on both sides and increasingly cementing an irreversible one-state reality that most people do not actually want.
So, Amotz, there we have the U.S. Secretary of State there, very pessimistic about the possibility of a two-state solution. What do you think?
Well, not that I'm much more optimistic than him, but I do think that several things need to be clarified. The first of them is that 90% of the Palestinians in the West Bank are ruled, certainly on a day-to-day basis, by the Palestinian authorities. So they are not fully occupied, at least in the experiential sense, as opposed to the legal sense. Having said that, in terms of practicality, I do think that the principle of land for peace and a two-state solution between pre-67 Israel in the pre-67 borders and a new Palestinian state in the West Bank, I think it is practical. I think that with proper leadership on both sides of this divide, this can happen, but the leaders need to be courageous people the way Sadat and Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein were. These people were not afraid even of being shot dead for the sake of peace, as tragically 2 of them indeed were. That takes courage, and this kind of courage, I'm afraid that the leaders that we today face lack. Having said that, we should also bear in mind that everything we currently experience and analyze is coming in the context of a rapidly transforming international system, and I don't only mean Trump's election, I mean also the European Union's steady and creeping dissolution and the rise of the right and the resurgence of Russia as a relevant superpower. I think that all these forces combined can, in very upcoming years, redraw the Middle East's borders. And I think that one crucial development that is imminent in this regard is the potential redefinition of Syria in a process that will begin in upcoming days in Kazakhstan. So sands around us are shifting rapidly, and we should understand that all the dynamics that have dominated the previous 50 years are about to change, possibly drastically.
Right, I guess context is very important when we look at this particular issue in terms of what is going on around the world. Hussein, we've heard of all these principles over the last few decades, you know. Land for peace, two states, side by side, peace and security, etc. Do you think that's still possible?
I do, for all the reasons that Amos listed, and I agree with him on every point except that it's just the fact that I don't think there's any Palestinian in the West Bank who doesn't feel the occupation on a daily basis. In fact, they do. They know they're occupied, and they feel it every day. But beside that, he was absolutely right. And, you know, the thing is, I would say that the two-state solution, in theory, as Perry said, the metaphysical two-state solution, he called it, is still viable for two main reasons. Number one, there isn't another option. Some version of two states is the only way of resolving this conflict. So, well, it won't work. I mean, I just don't think that these parties are ready to live together in peace and equality. I think one state is what the reality we have and have had de facto for the past 50 years, and it hasn't been peaceful. And we had it during the British mandate, and it led to catastrophes and violence. And it would, again, I mean, the single state, forced single state, unless you had a huge cultural change on both sides, is a prescription for more violence. There's no question, I think, about that. So some version of two states is the only way to end the conflict, which is the interests of almost all parties. So it's viable in that sense. And there are still barely majorities on both sides that want it, even though they don't think it's possible. As long as you've got people who want it, if the situation changes and the overall contextual changes that both Perry and Amotz were talking about change, and you get leaders, as Amotz rightly said, who have the guts and the vision to do it, which is essential. He's absolutely right. It's essential to have leadership. Then it will become possible again. But it may look very different than the traditional two-state solution that we're used to thinking about. It may have elements of confederation. There may be a Jordanian role. It may, the world is moving away from these little discrete small states into more regional conglomerations. Right. That can open, in coming decades, the possibility for resolving this in a more regional context.
Right. Perry, we started out this discussion talking about that UN resolution. And one of the complaints that the Israelis have had about the UN and these resolutions that have come up occasionally is that Israel is being singled out, that there are far more egregious things being done around the world. The UN doesn't look at that. It's always looking at Israel. And in that, Israel is supported by the outgoing Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, who said that, yes, these resolutions are counterproductive because they, people come out with their entrenched positions when there's a resolution like this. Does he have a point there?
Well, certainly there's a point. I mean, there's a kind of very poor history, if you will, at the UN of kind of anti-Zionist resolutions, particularly in the General Assembly. Personally, I would see this a little differently. This isn't a kind of General Assembly resolution that's kind of high on rhetoric, but substance-free in terms of content. Whereas this, I think it is a nuance. It's harsher than its predecessors, but there is a nuance here. I think we should point out to the viewers that the resolution, in very explicit terms, calls on the Palestinians to stop terror, to do everything they can, to stop the incitement, to increase their efforts to reduce incitement. So. It is, from an American perspective, it is a resolution that is very consistent with bipartisan administrations going back decades in terms of, opposing the settlement activity, but also, of course, being very outspoken and very vigorous in terms of Palestinian terrorist activity as well as incitement.
Okay. Amotz, very quickly, we're running out of time, but as far as the Israelis are concerned, is there a plan on the table right now? Is there some kind of framework within which they can work with the Palestinians?
I should say this. Hussein mentioned rightly the feeling of the average Palestinian in the West Bank, which he very rightly says that every one of those feels occupied, even if in many administrative and legal senses he may not be. He does feel that way. I would say that by the same token, and to answer your question, the average Israeli, when looking at how the Palestinian leaders depict and blame and baselessly accuse the Israelis and the entire Israeli cause, for instance, of defiling in their speech, in their words, defiling the Temple Mount, in their claim that there never were Jewish temples in Jerusalem, a claim that, by the way, antagonizes not only every Jew, but also every Christian. In the maps that they show their children, in which there is no pre-1967 legitimate Jewish state, because everything is supposed to be Palestinians. When Israelis look at all this, they feel desperate. They feel that they're being cheated. They feel that when they went to Oslo and were told that a two-state solution is on its way, and that the Palestinian leadership genuinely wants peace, that they were lying. This is the Israeli feeling, which is the inversion of the Palestinian feeling that Hussein has just rightly depicted. So I would say that the challenge to change involves all of this, and I can only hope that with the world changing in 10 days, maybe some of this will also be affected.
Hussein, very quickly,
Well,
your
I don't
response.
disagree. Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that's all right, and there's a whole list of Palestinian grievances. One of the saddest things is a group of people within Fatah, within the PLO leadership, wanted to propose an interim agreement to the Israelis, really breaking with Palestinian tradition. And the first response from the Israeli government was, "We're not interested. Don't even bring it to us." I don't know if they would have been able to get permission to do it, but that was just shot down right away, and that's a real pity because it was something worth exploring.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.